My name is Cory Stutes. I'm the Museum Curator for the Works, and I'm excited to get started on this presentation. Thank you all for joining me this evening. Hopefully you've been able to be a part of some of our other History at Home presentations that we've done over the last several months. But if this is your first time, welcome. I'm really glad that you were able to join us today. Tonight I will be talking about the historic theaters in downtown Newark. It's a topic I'm very excited about. It's been an interesting one to research, so I think it'll be a really good presentation. Just a few things to keep in mind. During the webinar, I welcome questions if you have any. I did send a message to everyone, so hopefully you saw that. But if not, there is a chat feature available in the webinar. In the Zoom window, you should see it looks sort of like a talking bubble, and you can use that to chat. So I welcome any questions throughout the presentation. You're welcome to type those there. Everyone is muted, so you won't be able to ask me questions directly, but you can use the chat box to type those. I will try my best to answer questions as they come in, but if I'm not able to get to some during the presentation, you're definitely welcome to hang around and I will answer those at the end. If you need any clarification about anything, something that I said, you want to go back to that, you're welcome to type that message as well. This is being recorded, so this will be available on our Facebook as well as our YouTube page. If anyone that you know wanted to take the opportunity to see the webinar but couldn't, it will be posted later at a later date. So this will be available for them to view as well. Like I said, let me know if you have any questions. Keep your eyes out for further History at Home webinars as well. We'll be posting those on our Facebook so you can stay in the loop. With that, I am going to go ahead and turn my camera off just so that it's not distracting from the pictures. And we can go ahead and get started with the presentation. So I wanted to start off with a description of the theaters that were in the downtown Newark area. We're all probably familiar with the Midland. Some of you are probably familiar with the Auditorium Theater. I know several of you probably remember the Arcade Theater, and there might even be a few others that you remember, maybe the Grand, but there were quite a number of theaters in the downtown area, as you can see. Of course, the definition of what constitutes a theater has changed somewhat over the years. Originally, they were stages and would have hosted live performances, acting, opera. A little bit later, they would have been hosts of vaudeville. There was also a period of time where several theaters, or what were referred to as theaters, had Nickelodeons. So for instance, if you look a little bit down the list, there's E and it says Penny Arcade. And while I don't know for sure, I suspect that that was probably a place where you could go and you could watch a Nickelodeon, which if you're not familiar, sort of like a animated type of moving thing. I'm not even sure if there is a definite definition of what a Nickelodeon is. Sometimes they hosted just a small show, but some sort of almost robotic animatronic type thing. I've seen some of them. So there were some of those around downtown Newark as well. But if you look at the list, it's very extensive. I will point out that some of them are in the same location. So if we look at D, the Orpheum Theater became the Alhambra Theater, became the Arcade Theater. So any of those, just to clarify sort of the labeling. Down at F, again, the same theater changed names a few times. So that did happen. Another thing that happened was that theaters moved. So for instance, the Wonderland Theater was in 2 different locations. So that does add to the length of the list overall. But there were quite a few theaters in the downtown area. So we'll start looking at some of them. Some of these were really not very long-lived. So there isn't a whole lot of information to be had about some of the theaters on this list because they simply didn't last for very long. And there really isn't very much that I can find about them. However, there are some of the theaters that really stood the test of time. Probably the four most prominent theaters in the downtown area were the Midland, the Auditorium, the Arcade Theater, and the Grand Theater. And then there were a few others that lasted for 10 to 15 years, and then several that were only around for a few years. So we'll get started and talk about some of these prominent theaters, but I wanted to start at the beginning. So really the first theater to speak of in Newark was the Newark Opera House, and that is pictured here in this photo. The Newark Opera House was built in 1865 by George Wallace, and while there could have been things that were described as theater-ish, probably, I'm sure a lot of dramatic societies, amateur musicians and that kind of thing were around, but they would have done their performances likely in churches. So in terms of having a dedicated space that was just a theater, this was the very first one in Newark. As I said, it was built in 1865 by George Wallace. He built it at a cost of $30,000, which seems pretty exorbitant to me for 1865. I don't know the exact what that would work out to in today's money, but that seems pretty pricey. This building was really one of the first kind of nice buildings in the West Main Street area. And in 1903, the Newark Opera House actually closed. And in an article describing that, they said that this was the impetus that helped the rest of West Main Street grow, because when they put this building in, it was much nicer than a lot of the other ones that were existing. So new businesses started to spring up, and it really helped that area expand. Wallace had originally built the building for some businesses. He owned a dry goods business at that point in time. Later on, I think he became a prominent real estate investor, but he built the building originally to house businesses on the ground floor. And I think several people suggested that he make the top floor into a theater, which is what he did. So you can sort of tell in this picture, in the center, you can see where it says Opera House above the arch, and there are stairs that go up, that would go up to the Opera House. So I had a question, was the Opera House and the Music Hall the same place? I'm not entirely sure what the Music Hall was. I haven't come across any place that was just called specifically the Music Hall, so I'm not sure whether or not they were the same place or not. It's definitely possible that they could have been, but there would be a lot of contenders for what could be the Music Hall. So I'm not sure, but that's a good question. And I really will look into something specifically called the Music Hall, because as I said, I haven't come across anything that was called that specifically. So it could be a number of things. There were also, I should mention that Music Hall, for instance, could have been, there were other like ballrooms around the area as well, which aren't included in this list of theaters in particular. And so there could be a chance that something like that was referring to another ballroom. For instance, there was a really large one that still exists on West Church Street. So it's possible that it could have been something like that as well. But thank you for the question, and that will give me something to look into. As I mentioned, the Newark Opera House closed in 1903. The building, though, stuck around. Several years later, well, a few years later, sometime around 1910, I don't know the exact date, another theater came in. Originally, it was called Schlegel and Bader, and it was on, I believe it was actually on the ground floor of the building, but it was in the same building. And then Joseph Bader, who was the proprietor of that, changed the name. He continued ownership, but the name was changed to the Mazda Theater. So the Mazda Theater was in this building for really only a few years. It closed in 1916. But then this building was converted to businesses, and it survived until 1957. So this building was still located on West Main Street. Eventually, the Arcade Annex extended south to West Main Street alongside this building, and it was demolished in 1957 to make way for a drive-up banking area for the Newark Trust. So this is a picture of it from July of 1957, excuse me, while the building was being demolished. So it really is a shame. It was almost 100 years old. You can tell there were some really, really nice details on the building. And if you were to visit the site today, this is what you would see. Just a parking lot. Unfortunately, that's the case with many of our historic sites. But as I repeatedly say in Newark, we are really lucky because we do still have a lot of intact historic buildings. Unfortunately, this isn't one of them. Next on the list, this is one that some of you might remember. I don't think anybody would remember the Newark Opera House. You might remember the building, but some of you will definitely remember the auditorium. This is a picture of what I think was one of Newark's finest buildings. The architecture on this is really indicative of the type of city that Newark was portraying itself to become and was really growing into. So I really like this building a lot. The cornerstone for this building was laid in June of 1894, and it's a municipal building. It was built as the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Building, and it was owned by the county. So this was a public building. The property had been purchased for $19,000. Originally, a house sat on the site. The house was later moved north, and then it was moved again in the 70s, and the house that was here is now home to the Heisey Museum on 6th Street. The theater was built and opened in March of 1895, and the very first performance in the theater was a performance of The Pirates of Penzance by the Newark Opera Club. And I do have some other pictures here, if I can get on the right. I really like this view because a lot of the pictures that you see of the auditorium are looking towards it from the north, or from the south looking north. And here we are in the north looking south. And the reason that I like this picture so much is because the house next to it, I have always been fascinated with that porch. If you kind of see, there's a round, almost turret-like, gazebo-like porch on that house, and I really like it. But this view is great because we can see a lot of the details on the building. Not only was this building used as a theater, but it housed several things in the front as well. This was home to the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR. They had a large collection of Civil War memorabilia in the building. This was also the first home of what's now the Licking County Library. The Newark Public Library got its start in March of 1918 in this building. So it was home to a lot of things in addition to a theater. The theater was really, really well equipped, and it was very well known. And I will say this is a photo of the GAR hall that was inside. So this is a really nice interior shot to see some of the details that were in there. But the theater was really well equipped, and it hosted really big name people. Some of the performers that graced the stage were people like Count Basie, Harry Houdini, Gene Autry, Elsie James, Frank James, who was the brother of Jesse James, and many, many other people who were very famous in their time. So this was sort of a big deal. It was a very important part of Newark's urban landscape, but it was also an important part of the economy because it really helped to attract a high caliber of performers. Newark was growing, and at this point in time, Newark was sort of in the second wave of manufacturing growth and economic growth, and it was really rapidly gaining a lot of new residents. And so the type of architecture and the scale of this building really just shows where Newark was at that point in time. Again, it was built in the 1890s, opened in 1895, and that was really around the time when we started to see the Newark Board of Trade becoming established and bringing a lot of things into the community. And there was a lot of money coming into the community. So this really shows this very ornate neoclassical style of architecture that is very elaborate. And I really don't think that we have anything now that matches this in terms of grandeur. Of course, we have the courthouse, which is very ornate and elaborate as well. So maybe you could count that. But really, I think this building overshadowed anything else, just in terms of its beauty and how ornate it is. So unfortunately, of course, this building is not still around. There was a huge loss to the community in April of 1968, and the building caught on fire. In the middle of the night, there was a fire set on the inside of the building. I had read that they used to leave the doors unlocked and people could come and go. A lot of times people would sleep inside the building, but it was accessible. So in the middle of the night, someone set a fire inside, and it was determined to be arson. And the fire swept through the front part of the building and unfortunately destroyed a lot of what was in there. I had mentioned the GAR had a large collection of Civil War memorabilia, and all of that was lost. The front was pretty wrecked. They had estimated the damage to be around $250,000. And at the time, the facade was damaged, but they had to make a decision whether or not they would rebuild the facade as it was, or whether they would put on a new facade. And they decided to put on a new facade. There was a wave in the mid-20th century of streamlining buildings, and they felt that elaborate design was distracting from the purpose of the building. So that's why a lot of the buildings that we have that were built around that time period are very plain, and it was a specific design choice. So they felt in keeping with being a modern city that that's what they would do. So they put on this facade, and I don't have that many pictures of it looking like this, but as you can see, it's quite different from what it used to look like. You can see above this modern facade, you can see the block of the theater itself rising in the background. They only replaced the facade with a two-story front made out of modern brick and glass. Definitely looks mid-century, even though the building itself at this point was already almost 80 years old. So over the years, the building was leased by the Midland Theater Corporation, but it was forced to close in 1978. Then the Licking County Players leased the building throughout the 1980s. And in 1991, they realized the building severely needed help. It needed a lot of repairs. They had attempted to propose a tax levy. Remember, this is a municipal building. It was actually owned by the public. So they could levy a tax in order to preserve it or fund it. However, the levy didn't pass in order to do that. So in 1992, the building was purchased by Dave Longaberger for $70,000, and he had planned to renovate it into a place to host events for Longaberger employees, as well as things for the community, plays and movies and that kind of thing. However, he had done a lot of, had a lot of people come and take a look at the building to see how much it would cost to renovate it. And the estimates for the work came back at millions and millions of dollars. I had seen somewhere that it was $25 million, which seems pricey. I'm not sure what all really needed done, but that is definitely expensive. So he decided that he wasn't going to be able to actually restore it due to that price. I had read that he originally wanted to rebuild the facade as it had been and bring it back to its former glory, but that just wasn't possible. So in 2002, the property was deeded to the Licking County Foundation, who funded the demolition of the building. So here we can see, this is a view of it looking north. So you can see the back of what's the actual theater is housed in that part, rising above. And then here it is after the demolition had begun. So they've taken this, and the rest of the theater is back there. So now today, of course, that's not there anymore. The Licking County Foundation built a small building in that site, and that's where they keep their offices now. So as we move on, the Auditorium Theater and the Newark Opera House, they were originally largely catering to live performances. A lot of vaudeville especially came through to the auditorium, and opera singers and that kind of thing. But as we moved into the 20th century, really around the end of the first decade of the 20th century, we start to see a rise in movies. And that quickly became the primary focus for theater goers. They wanted to see the newest motion pictures that they could. And as we saw in the map in the beginning, there were quite a few theaters around. And that's because, unlike today, you didn't go to a theater and have your choice of multiple movies. Most theaters had one screen and one auditorium, so you could only see whatever they were playing at that point in time. So different theaters would play different movies, and they would advertise and try to attract the best crowd based on whatever they were showing. They would contract with production houses to get their entire collection of movies so that they could only be the only ones who would show a specific movie. So it was competitive, and it drove their sales and created a whole sort of network of theaters that you could go to depending on what you wanted to see. So this is a newspaper page from 1919, I believe, but I pulled it because I wanted to show, you can see there are so many different ads for different theaters. We can see names like Grand, Lyric, Gem, the Auditorium. There isn't an ad on the side, but there is a little written paragraph for the Alhambra. So you can see just in this section how many theaters there were at this point in time that were trying to get people to come view their movies. So I mentioned the Grand. This is one that several people might remember. It was around until 1954. And this is one of Newark's earliest what became a dedicated movie theater. So I think originally when it opened, they did have, you could go see a Nickelodeon there, but it quickly transitioned to be a movie theater. So the Grand Theater was actually started around 1909 by a man named A.L. Thomas. And he, after a few years, brought on a partner named Frederick Stevens, who he eventually sold the theater to. And then in 1920, the theater was purchased by a man named Charles Price, who the Price family ended up operating the theater until it closed in 1954. And he was helped by his sons to operate it as well, so it truly was a family business. Here's another picture of the entrance of the Grand Theater. The theater was located in a building that had been a dry goods store, and in fact, half of the building was still a store while the Grand Theater was there. It was the Boston One Price store. It was in there for several years. As I said, here's another picture, and you can see that other half as the Boston store. This picture is from around 1920. So the theater was there, didn't have the grand marquee on the front of it like we saw in the last picture, but just very small letters. It says Grand over the entrance. This building, as I said, the business closed in 1954, and the building was still around for not quite 20 years, but it did stand on South Park Place until 1972, at which point it was torn down. It was replaced, but this is a view of the inside of the theater. And this is actually right around the time that it opened. This is from 1909. And you can see it says Welcome GAR. They were hosting an event for the GAR, which was, if you're not familiar, which was an organization for veterans of the Civil War. So you can see this is, it looks like a stage in the front. This picture quality, of course, isn't super great, but we can still make out a lot of details, and much smaller than what our modern day theaters are. You can see just a few rows of seats on either side of the aisle, but it does look like they could probably fit a good number of people in there. A lot of the theaters around the downtown area, aside from the auditorium and eventually, of course, the Midland, which were bigger, but a lot of the theaters in the area would have probably looked similar to this. After the building was torn down in 1972, the lot sat vacant for several years. And then this building, which is there now, was built in the late 80s and opened in 1989. It was built by Wachtel and MacNally, which was or still is, an architecture firm, and they have their offices there. So that spot is still filled by this building that we see now. It's really the only new building on South Park Place that wasn't built in the 1870s. So it's really unique that we have so many buildings still on South Park. That one there. If you remember going to the Grand Theater, I would love to hear from you. So feel free to type something in the chat box or send me an email later. My email address and my phone number will be at the end of the presentation. So I would love to hear your memories if you experienced going to the Grand Theater or really any of the other theaters that we talk about in this presentation. The next theater is one that might not be as familiar, and this is the Lyric Theater. So this picture, you can just see it on the left-hand side. You can see the sign that says Lyric Theater. And I'm not sure of the exact year that it started, but I know that it was in operation by 1909. And this was a smaller theater. It was operated by a man named John Gallagher. And this is located on South 3rd Street. So just for reference, this is the site today, approximately where that parking lot is where this theater is. So if you look up, you can see the Trust building up there in the background. Unfortunately, a lot of the buildings in the foreground suffered from a fire or were replaced by other buildings throughout the 20th century. So not many of the ones in the foreground, actually none of the ones in the foreground exist, but some of them along 3rd Street do still exist, as you can see. So that's where it was located, just for reference. The Lyric Theater eventually changed its name to the Rex Theater. And I believe, I have the date here of when that was. That was in 1920. It changed to the Rex Theater. And then in the late 20s, the Rex closed as well. However, I mentioned that it was operated by John Gallagher, and he actually operated 2 theaters in Newark. The other one was the Gem Theater, which was located on South Park Place. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the Gem Theater, and I have been searching for literally years to find a picture of it. I find it really hard to believe that photos of South Park Place or this specific part of South Park Place weren't taken between 1914 and the 30s. I know that there would be, so I know a photo of it has to exist. I just have never come across one, and I've been looking for one for probably 6 years. So if anybody finds one of the Gem Theater, let me know. I'd be happy to view it. So as I mentioned, the Gem Theater opened in 1914, and if you can see my cursor, it was located in this building right here, this white one. And on the top, it says Union Cafe. I know that's difficult to read because of the angle, but that's where the theater was located. That building had been built many years before, in the 1870s or so. But it was operated, as I said, by John Gallagher. His wife was involved in the business. His son helped him. It really was a family thing. This is the building today. It's changed quite a bit. It's the short one in the center, which is now home to H&R Block on South Park Place. And I also don't know when or why the 3rd floor was removed. That's a mystery that has plagued me and haunted me, along with trying to find a picture of it. Part of why I want to find a picture. Later on, if anyone remembers O'Coon's drugstore, it was located there as well, which I think by the time the drugstore was there, it was already missing the 3rd floor. So the mystery persists because I don't know what happened to it. Anyway, there is a bigger story behind this building. So as I mentioned, this is John Gallagher. And unfortunately, this is what happened. So in 1921, John Gallagher was shot in the lobby of the theater and died instantly in the theater. There was a gentleman who was visiting the theater. He was watching a movie, and he had been asked several times to settle down. I'm not sure whether he was talking. He was making some sort of disruption in the movie. And he had been asked by people to stop doing whatever he was doing. Eventually, he was asked by Alva Gleason, who was the usher, and he was removed by Gleason. Well, come to find out, the guy who was causing a stir, he was actually drunk. And when he was brought out to the lobby, he wasn't very happy. So they got into an actual fist fight. The guy's name was Carl Shirley, and he got into a fight with Alva Gleason, who's actually pictured here. This photo is Alva Gleason. So they got into a fight, and John Gallagher was in his office upstairs and heard what was going on. So he came down to the lobby, and when he came down, Shirley pulled a gun and shot, and it ended up hitting Gallagher. There were several other people around too. There was a lady that was working in the ticket booth who fainted when it happened. There were bullets that were lodged in the ticket booth. And in fact, they had to break the door to get out because the booth had been struck by bullets as well. And it had done something to keep the door from being able to open. They found bullets lodged in woodwork. So he shot multiple times, fired the gun multiple times. So the man was arrested. He was eventually charged for the murder. He was working here temporarily. He was from Alabama. So his family had come to try to help him because he didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a lot of money for that. But of course, there were many witnesses. There was no getting off. Everybody knew what he had done. It was very visible. He I think was attempting to say that he was intoxicated, so he didn't know what he was doing, but it was very clear what had happened. So unfortunately, that was a really tragic thing that happened, but it didn't signal the end of the theater's business. The theater continued to operate until the early 1930s. The last mention of it, and I'm not sure when exactly it closed, but it sort of falls off the radar in 1932, because the last mention of it in the Newark Advocate is May of 1932. And I couldn't find anything else after that, so I assume it had to close at some point around there. So moving on, we see a couple of familiar things. We just talked about the Auditorium Theater, so we see that here. The Midland Theater, I'm sure we recognize, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But in the bottom, this is really the only picture that I've ever been able to come across of the Arcade Theater. And this is another one that people might remember. So please, again, reach out to me if you do have memories of the Arcade Theater, because I would love to hear about your experience there or any memories that you might have. The Arcade Theater was located, its address was 5 Arcade Annex, which sounds kind of funny, but it was located just where the Arcade Annex branched off of the main arcade to go to West Main Street. And I do have a photo of, so this is actually during the demolition, but I'm trying to, oh, here we go. So here is the photo of where it is today. So not really much to see other than a parking lot, but just to give you some reference if you're familiar with the arcade. So this is on the south sort of side of the stretch of the arcade. And there used to be, as I mentioned earlier, there used to be an annex that went down to West Main Street, and the Arcade Theater was right sort of in the elbow of that annex. For a while, there was an entrance, I think, that you could come in from West Church Street as well and come right to the theater. The Arcade Theater, though, was known by a few names. So originally, when the arcade was built, when the theater was built, rather, attached to the arcade, I don't think it was originally part of it. It was called the Orpheum Theater. So in the early part of the 20th century, within a few years of the arcade's opening, which was in 1909, the Orpheum Theater opened. It lasted as the Orpheum for several years, and then its name changed to the Alhambra Theater. And that was in 1913 when it first became known as the Alhambra. Then, in the 1930s, I believe, it switched from the Alhambra to the Arcade Theater. So they sort of simplified the name, made it a lot easier, I guess, to know where it was. And it became the Arcade Theater. So in 1957, we'll go back to this picture, the same year, the same time as the old Newark Opera House was being torn down, the Arcade Theater was being torn down as well. And it was for the same purpose. It's because they were making room for the Newark Trust banking, for their drive-through banking, as well as some parking for the Newark Trust. And they were clearing out space there. So that really was the beginning of that area getting cleared out, because nowadays really the only thing that's there is the Newark City Administration building and then a lot of parking lot until you get to the old Sparta building, which is now Elliott's, and of course the arcade is still there. But that area was pretty densely filled with other buildings as well. So they started clearing those out in 1957, and this is a picture of that demolition. So now let's talk about the Midland. Of course, when we talk about downtown Newark's historic theaters, the Midland has to be one of them that comes to mind because we're all still so familiar with it. We're so fortunate to still have the Midland in our community. And I think it's really one of the sort of cornerstones of downtown Newark now because it's such a beloved piece of our local landscape. So this is a picture of the Midland during construction. They built these sort of barricades so that you couldn't see what was going on behind there. They, of course, had to tear down buildings that pre-existed the Midland. You can still see a house just on the very right edge of the photo. Now, of course, that's gone because the Midland extends all the way to East Church Street. That house was moved, and I believe it still exists in another location. That's a conversation for another day, though, because I don't know that as a fact. It's more of a hunch. Anyway, I love this photo because you can see the different ads that they placed. Of course, if they're going to put up a big wall, it pays to advertise on it. As well, you can see some very small storefronts in the front of it. And those would have been small shops that could have still been around before they eventually had to be brought down. I'm sure while this wall was up, they were probably excavating because if you think about the theater, when you walk into the theater, you walk down to the front. So there has to be a lot of digging out in order to put a theater there for the pit and everything under the stage and all of that. So there would have been a lot of groundwork, literally and figuratively, before they could have started actually putting up the walls. Here we have a photo right before the opening. So you can see soon it says Midland Theater, high class entertainment. And so they were getting, the theater opened on December 20th, 1928. Took them about a year to build. And there was a huge opening night that was scheduled that they had the mayor there. There was a concert. They had a vaudeville show. And they really were excited because they were able to show a movie called The Shopworn Angel, which hadn't actually come out yet at the time. It was scheduled by Paramount to release in January of the next year, but they had arranged for a special showing of the movie there. So that's a really exciting thing to happen in Newark for a movie that's not even out yet to be played there. And in fact, one of the stars of the movie was Gary Cooper when he was young. It should be mentioned also that that was a silent movie. However, about a week later, and I got this from the Midland's website, I would suggest checking out their Facebook page and their website because if you're a history buff, they have a lot of great information on there. And they also post really cool pictures from the theater's past as well as what's going on there. So some of these pictures I did get from their Facebook page. I definitely recommend liking it if you don't already because there's a lot of cool stuff on there. But anyway, so they mentioned that about a week after the theater opened, they played the first movie with sound in Newark, and it was called Manhattan Cocktail. So that's another big milestone for the Midland Theater. The theater was a staple of downtown Newark. Here you can see the inside. It's absolutely gorgeous. The original chandelier, which I remember hearing was made by Heisey. It was very fancy. You can tell how ornate the interior of the building was. Continuing into the middle of the 20th century, it was so popular, such a place to be. You can see by all the bikes lined up there. I think that there was something special going on here. I had heard about the origin of this photo, but I don't remember for sure what it was that everyone was lined up for. This is, I think, in the 1940s when this photo is from. But it was active, thriving theater for many, many years. Unfortunately, it sort of saw the end of that part of its life in 1978. We just passed the anniversary of the blizzard of 1978, and whether we knew it or not, that was also the anniversary of the end of what could have been the end of the Midland altogether. During that blizzard, some pipes froze and burst within the theater, which caused extensive flooding within it, but also meant that the boiler system needed repaired. So that closed the theater indefinitely. Unfortunately, while it sat vacant, it started to rapidly deteriorate. I had heard from somebody that the chandelier was shot out and the building started to really suffer from being vacant. These are some more photos that I got from the Midlands Facebook, but they posted them to show what the interior looked like when it was, before it was renovated. So much like the auditorium, this building was also purchased by Dave Longaberger in 1992. And he did a lot for this area, bought a lot of buildings, saved a lot of buildings, really helped out the local economy that way. Unlike the auditorium, though, he was able to finance the restoration of this one. So he purchased the building in 1992, and they undertook an 8-year renovation. Unfortunately, Dave Longaberger passed away before the theater actually opened, but because of him, because of his vision, it's here today, and we're able to go and visit it now. So I have a few other pictures. You can see some of the views of the inside of what it looked like. It really suffered from the years that it was empty. Here we can see a picture in the 90s, and I like this photo because you can see the Midland in the front and the auditorium is still there in the background. So luckily, the Midland is in its second golden era, its second phase of life, because it was fully restored and they were able to get it up and running again to its former glory. And it reopened on September 14th of 2002 and is still opening today. Of course, right now, I'm not sure whether they're having shows or anything just due to regulations because of the pandemic, but they are still definitely a central part of our downtown community and part of Newark. So today, this is what it looks like on the inside. Absolutely gorgeous, and we're so lucky to have it. Here's a picture showing you towards the stage. So if you remember some of those pictures before, quite a difference. And there it is, looking as good as it ever did. So I have a couple of other pictures of theaters that, or this one that I wanted to share just because I had this interior picture and I thought we could talk about where a few of the other theaters were. So this is the interior of the Bijou Theater, which was located at 19 West Main Street. And this is one of the older theaters that was in Newark. It opened pretty early. It shows up in the city directory in 1909. So it was most likely open before that, sometime between 1907 and 1909 it opened. And I read an article where it had been redecorated and they were heralding the color scheme, which was brown and tan. Doesn't sound that exciting, but I'm sure it looked wonderful. And they had metal ceiling, it said, and they had gotten new lighting, and they really jazzed the place up, trying to maintain business. This is a picture of where it was located. This is 19 West Main Street. Looking at this building, you would never think that there was a theater in there. And I don't know that I've ever been in this building to know whether any footprint of that still remains or even where within the building it was. It's possible that that theater was on the second floor. I don't actually have that information to know what floor of the building it was even on. So I would be interested to know if anybody might know whether or not there are remnants of the theater anywhere within this building, because that would be very interesting to me to find out. But that was the Bijou Theater. It did close fairly early as well. As I mentioned, it was around probably around 1908 to 1909 it opened. And by the mid 1910s to before 1920, it was closed down. So I wanted to bring back this map again because there are some of these that I didn't mention because, as I said, I don't have too much information about them. Some of them are in really interesting places too. A lot of them, the buildings don't still exist. The Electric Palace Theater, I tried to find more information about that, but I wasn't successful in that. But it was located at 47 South 2nd Street. So if you see where the letter A is down here, now that location is home to the parking garage. But there were buildings there before, and it was located in one of those buildings. The Musée, which is letter C, that was actually located within the Warden Theater or Warden Hotel block. So it was something within the Warden Theater. That one didn't show very long in the city directory, so I'm not sure how long it was open. Same with the Electric Palace Theater. A lot of these seem to have only been around for a year or two. I mentioned the Penny Arcade, which I suspect was probably home to Nickelodeon. The Wonderland Theater is another one that interests me because it was around for a few years. Originally, it was at 29 South 3rd, which was the location of the Lyric Theater, if you remember back to that picture. Of course, now it's just a parking lot. But the Wonderland Theater moved to 23 South Park. So I'm not sure why it moved. Typically, when they would sell a theater, the buyer, whoever bought the building, would buy the theater and buy the business. But clearly that business stuck around and just moved. Presumably, John Gallagher bought the Lyric Theater building, or a company that he operated, purchased the building and prompted the Wonderland Theater to move. But unfortunately, I don't know very much about the Wonderland Theater. We talked about the Bijou Theater. The Empire Theater was the precursor to the Gem Theater on South Park Place. So if you remember back where the H&R Block is, the Empire Theater there was only for about 2 years before the Gem Theater. Of course, Schlegel and Bader, we mentioned, was in the same building as the Newark Opera House, which then became the Mazda Theater. And the Cozy Theater, I only saw it in 1 year in the city directory, but it was located at 73 East Main Street, which if we look, it's letter L. Over here now is one of the court buildings, but it was located in a small building that was approximately in that location. And then of course the Midland Theater and the Newark Opera House we have talked about. So as you can see, there were quite a few theaters in downtown Newark. Again, we think about in the Midland, depending on what era we grew up in, we might think about the Auditorium, we might think about the Grand Theater, but we don't necessarily think about this many theaters in downtown Newark. And of course, these didn't all coexist at the same time. This is a list that spans decades. So it's a little bit, misleading to think that there were all these theaters all at one point in time. However, many of these buildings some of them that do still stand, we would never immediately look at and ever think that there would be a theater in there. So I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind how many different uses so many of the buildings that we see every day have had over their lifespan. And now, as I mentioned earlier, there were also performances that would have been held in churches, schools. Also, there were ballrooms and things like what's now 31 West. So there were other locations as well where performances would have been had. There are on the Sanborn maps, which are detailed insurance maps of the downtown area. You can see a couple of other buildings that do have stages that may or may not have been for vaudeville acts or something like that. However, I based this list off of businesses that were listed in the city directories as theaters or as motion picture houses, because I figured that that was probably the best way to gain what the community's perception would have been of these theaters and what their primary use would have been. So there could have absolutely been other buildings that have played host to performances actors, plays, musicians, even probably movies, but may not have just been exclusively theaters. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as well. If there are places that we're trying to locate, maybe not necessarily finding on this list, it could be because of that. So I would like to thank everyone for your participation. I really appreciate your support of our History at Home programming over the last several months. Again, we are continuing this. Let me turn my camera back on here. We are continuing these videos once a month. So for now, keep your eye on our Facebook page so that you know when they are, what the topics will be. Also, I'm very open to suggestions of future topics. Every once in a while, someone will send me an email and ask if I know about a certain type of business or a type of building or something specific. Or they might say, I would really like to hear more about theaters. So that really helps me out because it gives me something to look into, and I can always use the inspiration for more topics that everyone's interested in hearing about. If you have any questions, I know I got one question during the presentation, but if you have any questions now, I would invite you to ask them. You can use the chat box if you would like to ask a question. Otherwise, my email address and my phone number are both on the screen, so please feel free to email me at any time. If you have a question about something that I said during the presentation, or if it's just about anything else relating to Licking County, local history, anything like that, I would love to answer your questions. So I do really appreciate everyone's participation and your willingness to listen to me rattle on for an hour. I really do appreciate it. So it doesn't look like I have any other questions. So with that said, thank you again so much. I appreciate everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.